Very flattering photographs in the programme, but I think the better way to find out exactly what Luke and I are about is to read our Twitter profiles. And what I've discovered is I am never ever going to be cool, because I'm called @Ceri Gould, and this is what mine says. Editor-in-Chief of Reach PLC, Southeastern Cambridge, love my family, Wales, rugby, reading, mountain exercise and wine. Very boring. This is what Luke says. I'm bad at life. How cool is that? We live in a hell world of our own making, but at least the memes are good.
I used to have sometimes in there, but they're all good now.
Yeah, they're all good now. I'm also going to quote Luke's tweets back at him today, so I apologise for that. He also says, mainly, I know how to make things that tons of people read, watch and share, and it's those sort of skills which Luke will be very kindly guiding us through today. I'll give you a little roadmap of where I think we're going to go for the next 20 minutes. The question in the programme, it sort of assumes that that digital play, they have an advantage over the traditional model, so we're going to interrogate that question a bit and see, does it, and if it does, what it is. I think it does. It's probably all about the ability to grow a brand. And then we're going to ask, can that be helpful? Can the listicle sort of Buzzfeed format, can that be a downside? And also addressing the criticism, the unfair criticism, I think that sort of digital storytelling sometimes gets. And then just throw in there the idea that actually this is nothing new, and this is basically what magazines and Sunday newspapers have been doing very well, having lots of opinion, telling stories by lists and having strong sells. And then Luke will give us, hopefully, an insight into the difference between BuzzFeed and the Eye, and also how it compares with sort of our own storytelling. And then just, if he doesn't mind, we're going to take an overnight news list, which one of the journalists filed without even realising I was going to do this, and try and put into practice what we're actually talking about, because this has been a brilliant conference, but sometimes you can feel inspired and then you try and put it into practice at 9 a.m. on a Thursday, and you think, I don't know what to do about this. So Luke's very kindly agreed to do that blind, which is great. And then we'll finish off by hopefully doing 3.5 things that we should do tomorrow. 3.5, I thought that would be the new listicle, the 0.5s. You never know, Stefan's saying yes. So to start off then, Luke, the digital play, what do you think we can learn from digital play only, and what's the key advantage of that?
Well, I think that saying that it's better or superior or anything like that is kind of missing a point. It was superior up until about 4 months ago, and then they changed the Facebook algorithm. Mm-hmm. It still obviously has a lot of advantages in terms of, I think that it basically allows people to have their own relationship with the newspaper, rather than buying a newspaper and reading the whole thing and saying, well, this is our newspaper. People are essentially editing their own newspaper just by consuming it in a certain way, whether that's through Facebook or just the sections or verticals they click on. Which means that what your brand is becomes much more diverse, basically. It becomes, you end up having a more personal relationship with your readers on digital, which is a really good advantage, particularly for local news, where your relationship with your readers and trust is so important. The way that people interact with those brands and basically build their own newspapers by what they look at means that they have strong relationships. And
the newspaper sort of method of being where you're all things to all people, which was then translated into websites, that's at a disadvantage from the start then?
Yes and no, because obviously people do still do that to a certain extent. I think what digital really revealed was that what people are interested in isn't necessarily what people think, that what people may have thought they're interested in. We pretty much found out that people are really interested in weather and transport news and crime and a variety of other things, and sport obviously is a big one. But it also revealed that people didn't necessarily read all of the stuff on the website. So the challenge then becomes like figuring out how to present those stories that maybe people don't click on, that they skip over and they don't build into their own version of your brand. In a way that they actually will engage with, because obviously many of them are really important, and many people will care about the issues in them, even if they're not actually clicking and reading those posts.
And so, how helpful was it then that BuzzFeed owned the listicle format, and then shoehorned majority of its coverage into that format?
So the list format was really big between about 2013 and 2016, and then it went out a little bit at BuzzFeed, and I think in other places as well, kind of followed it in that. I think what the list did was really make people understand how people consume things on the internet differently. But what they also did was mean that people would come to it looking at, you could come to a story that you'd usually say, here's a straight news write of this story, and say, well, maybe what if we did this as a list? Is there a way that we do it differently? Would we pull out different points? Would we try and target a different user? And then even if you don't write it as the list or as a quiz or as a long form piece or as a video, the information, just thinking about like what is the right format for this and opening up the formats you look at, mean that you end up writing a very different version of your original piece. Even if the piece ends up being a straight news, you can take that information of like, I know that there's a person out there that I need to target this at, so I'm actually going to write it in a different way and target it at them rather than headlining it in the conventional way that might usually do that.
Yeah, and I think that writing for the digital and pausing before you write something and talk about and thinking about how you want it to be presented can actually help stop you writing the things that nobody's reading.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't think there's anything wrong with writing things that no one reads. I think there's a problem with writing them five times. But I'm a big fan of the idea of like, yeah, if someone writes something and 10 people read it, then great, that's a lot you've learned from that. And also the stuff that you write that maybe 10 people read, eventually you're going to do one and 10,000 people are going to read it, and it's going to be totally unexpected. But making sure you've still got that experimentation and that coming at it and figuring out new ways to look at the thing that maybe usually 10 people would read, finding a way to present it that 1,000 people read it, that 10,000 people read it, totally changes how you can come at it. And it's a huge opportunity for newsrooms just to, I think, keep experimenting and never be too scared to say, like, well, this won't do any traffic, we'll abandon it. It's like, okay, how do we find a way that makes it do traffic?
Yeah. And so what do you say to the people who, you say listicle, they say that's not journalism?
Well, the 10 Commandments was a list.
It's a 10 list, though. That is,
it was a 10.
God didn't
10.
abide by the rules.
Martin Luther's 42 precepts, then. They're a list in news, have all been around for a long time, and there's a reason. It's a really simple way to present information, and more people would benefit from doing it. But it doesn't mean that everything has to be a list. But the information, the learning from the idea of a list, hey, how do we make this simple? How do we make sure that people know exactly what they're going to get so that they don't get to the page and you're either disappointed or it's not exactly what they want? That's kind of the secret behind why lists work. People say, oh, I know that there are 18 things in this list, which means that I'm going to read 18 things. They get what they expect, and that's what people really like. And that's why clickbait never truly worked, because you need people to get what they expect to see.
Yeah, and also I think there's a misconception that writing stories as a list is somehow easy and throwaway, and actually it's all about the authentic voice and ringing true and all the things that as local journalists we own. We should own that territory. Nobody should be able to speak about the local area in as authoritative way as we should.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you guys at Wales Online eventually sort of lent off lists as well, didn't you, in the later years? Why did you end up doing less lists? So with Wales Online, which I don't edit anymore, just to say that, when I took over, it was effectively the receptacle for the print titles, and what we tried to do as a team was to say, well, actually, could it not be its own thing? Could it not have its own voice and personality? And we started by doing it from the premise, well, if you live in Cardiff and Swansea, you might not like anyone who lives in Cardiff or Swansea, but we all love Wales, and that was the guiding principle of it. And then we realised Buzzfeed, it was 2015, we did our first listicle. We actually introduced listicles to regional journalism, and it went, and there was a huge appetite for it, and we thought actually vis-a-vis Buzzfeed we could do it better for our own regional areas than your team at the time could. Sure. And then you did, I think you started doing less, certainly Wales Online and other titles that you're in charge of, I guess, do fewer lists now. Do you think that's a result of people kind of getting bored of the format? Like it needs to be specifically used, I'd have thought now.
No, I think it's got to be one of the tools, isn't it? So in the South East and Cambridge, what we're trying to do is say, when people come to our sites, they should be able to expect 5 ways of telling a story. So a listicle will be one of them. A data downward would be another, sort of like a lean back read using data like David Otwell was talking about. And there are these videos, which is very important. And so they should be able to expect our stories told in those ways every visit. So sort of building on it, yeah. And then the idea then that everything that we did on Wales Online was effectively everything that I had done sort of 5 years previously on Wales on Sunday. So the idea is that nothing's new, and so all the opinion and all the fun, which I think the listicles deliver, that's all print and that's all magazines.
Yeah, I mean, there are people, as I say, people have doing lists for thousands of years. But I think that if you can find a way to bring your numbers in on one side, whether it's lists, whether it's maybe you find that long form works, maybe you find that any number of things work, finding a way to support some of the stuff where maybe you don't get the traffic on it initially, your post that does 10 views, by having another post on the site that does 2,000, you could got the time to experiment with that smaller post and start to build that audience on that side as well.
And you've got quite interesting views on Chartbeat. Do you want to share those?
I'm not a huge fan of Chartbeat. I think it makes people respond to it too quickly. Like, it has real benefits for certain things, on the like very quick breaking news, sport, for example, it's great for. But I think for a lot of stories, you're going to have stuff that takes 2 or 3 days to develop, or takes a week to develop. So watching it at Chartbeat and saying, "Oh, this didn't immediately blow up the internet," that's fine. Come back in a week. Come back in a month. Maybe then it'll start working. So you don't want to make any hard and fast decisions based on like these sudden Chartbeat spikes.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to read out 2 headlines for the same story. So one that the Eye you did recently, it's got your byline on it, and one which one of our Reach sites did. So see if you can tell which is which. A restaurant tried to name and shame a reservation no-show, but had to apologise instead. That's headline number 1. And the other headline number 2 is, a restaurant tweets out personal details of a customer who didn't turn up. Now my analysis is that they're both very good, they're both fresh, they're very clean, that sort of clean journalism which is very fashionable at the moment, and which the Eye is making a name for. But what would you say is the difference between one or two?
Well, the difference, I think, is marginal. I'm a big proponent of kind of conversational headlines. I think the best way to tell a story is probably why you explain to your editor why the story needs to be written. It's a good story. And so something like that saying, yeah, this restaurant tried to shame someone and it totally backfired on them is an effective way to tell that story. And if you move it around for language to make sure it's like the most readable version of it. But that, I would argue, is the way into the story. But there's also another thing there which trying to remember exactly why we did that headline, but my recollection is that we'd previously had a couple of posts where restaurants naming and shaming of customers and reservations had done really well, and people were clearly really into this idea of like, what is the politics around restaurants not showing up? People who know people who work in restaurants know this is a major issue. People who work in restaurants obviously know this is a major issue. But at the same time, there's the question of like, maybe this goes too far. So it's really tapping into that, like, what are the politics and what are the right moral story at it, and it provokes a lot of discussion. And that's kind of what I think why we went that angle. Okay. But it was a few weeks ago, so I can't remember.
Okay, I'm going to quite try and get the news list out so you can have a look at. So this is just an overnight list, which I'm sure some of you get your reporters to file. I got them to file it this week. They say, my life of hell living on a council estate, have council comments and pics, just need writing up. What would you do with that one?
Well, I'd be cautious about using council estate because I worry that plays into classist stereotypes a little much. But the general take on that I would say with that one is that the idea of a life of hell is kind of an over-dramatizing phrase, and while I'm kind of curious what the life of hell is, what I'd rather click on is someone explaining why it's a life of hell. Is there people driving cars up and down? Is there loud music? Is there a satanic cult? You know, any one of the normal things you get on an estate. So kind of bringing that to the front and saying, like, here is the weird thing, I think putting as much information in the headline and telling people what they're going to get on it means people are actually more likely to, A, click on the story, and B, continue reading the story and share the story, which is kind of the double part of what you're trying to do here, which is firstly get people into your story, and then secondly get people to engage with it beyond just the story itself, whether that's arguing in the comments, whether that's sharing it, whether that's sending to a friend. Whichever version of that is helpful for both SEO and social algorithms. Okay,
one more then. Woman, open quotes, hanging from ex-pier, holding a life ring, close quotes, saved by rescue crews, brackets, just needs writing up.
So I think with something like that, obviously I don't know the full story, but I would generally go, again, much more conversation with that, because what's clearly happened, the actually interesting part of that is that someone's fallen off and is then hanging on. So the fact that it wouldn't include the idea of falling off seems like a missing piece, basically. So yeah, that would probably be something along the lines of a woman fell off and held on to a life ring. I'd also probably put a time in there. If she held on for a minute, that's not a very interesting story. If she's held on for 3 hours, that's really something. So yeah, figure out like that as well. And people also really like the idea of specific numbers in headlines, whether it's prices or times or whatever, because it helps them contextualize in their own lives, which brings the headline home and then makes people much more likely to engage in it, which I found other people's experience may be different.
Okay, great. And then could you just share with us what are the differences between writing for, because you're senior editor of The Eye and when you're senior editor of Buzzfeed, is there any specific vocabulary that you would use in The Eye but wouldn't in Buzzfeed, or vice versa?
Well, I mean, the obvious one with Buzzfeed is the headlines that have, OMG, something happened and I'm laughing or whatever. We wouldn't really use that in The Eye because The Eye has a slightly different brand. But I think that's probably as far as it goes that way. In terms of the other way, what we're trying to do with The Eye is find a way to build a kind of trusted news brand, which obviously is what everyone's trying to do. We have a slight advantage in that we don't have the same legacy of history. We're not hated in Liverpool like The Sun. We're not hated outside of London like The Guardian. We have a slightly more balanced ability, and so we can really maintain that by making sure our headlines are conversational, that people can understand them easily, but without going into the sort of hyperbole that BuzzFeed or some other outlets might do.
I think you are the sort of you are the clean journalism, like the clean eating type answer for journalism, aren't you?
I mean, we're slightly more enjoyable than that, but yeah.
Couscous is very nice. Okay, thank you. And then could you possibly scrape 3.5 things that you think as local journalists we should do every day or every week or?
So having just said that I'm not a huge fan of the chartbeat model of watching traffic, I do think data is super important, but the importance with data is very much not looking at just views. It's about, there's not ever going to be a golden metric. It's not going to be views, it's not going to be unit visitors, but what you do want to do is look at essentially a mix of metrics. So it's time on site, it's number of pages looked at afterwards, it's returning visitors, and all these things come together to look at the overview. And even if you do have a piece that maybe has 10 views on it, that again is also useful information. Maybe those 10 people spent a lot of time on that, so there's a thing of, wait, once people got there, they're really into it, so we just need to get them there. And kind of following on from that, I guess point 2 would be read the comments. If your comments hate you, if their comments love you, there's so much information in them, and it really gets at what people actually care about and picks out the important pieces from whatever you're writing. Which means that maybe what you think is actually the important point, everyone's actually picking up on something you put in paragraph 5, and maybe that's the thing that you can follow up in the future to find the new thing. And point 3, I don't think I had another one, but I don't have another one. Those are my 2.
Okay, that's great. I think my time is about up. So should we go for questions? Oh, I'm giving they have to pour drum roll now to get from one side to the other. That's really bad. I'll pick out 2 of my favourite headlines then from your BuzzFeed days. One is 25 totally fucking hilarious tweets from Christmas 2016.
So that was a traditional thing that I used to do where I always used, because I hate Christmas, I always used to write a post on Christmas Day because no one else was writing, and it would always do huge amounts of traffic because the site was so dead.
And I also because you did a lot of moving into the video, didn't you? So video storytelling, but this is one of my favourite. You should Google this. It's here's the reason everyone thought gooey aliens could have babies, and the video was called "Gooey Alien Baby Mystery Solved."
I don't remember what it's called in the video, but yeah, that was a very early stage when I switched over from more written stuff to video to try and experiment there. And if you remember those baby aliens that everyone said you could put in a little plastic thing and they had babies, and the rumor was they had babies, we eventually figured out that actually there was a certain brand that did come with babies inside, which meant that some people thought that there was some 10% of people did actually get ones with babies in. But then everyone became convinced you could do it by pulling it in half or freezing it or whatever nonsense it was.
Yeah, but it's a good challenge for telling a story via video, which I think we should all definitely take that on board. Thank you.